A mafia boss walked into a diner and saw a waitress he once loved, thinner, exhausted, working double shifts. Then a small boy in the corner looked up at him. Same eyes, same stare. And his whole world stopped making sense. The rain was heavy that night in Brooklyn. It had been pouring for hours, turning the streets dark and empty, chasing everyone indoors. Roman Vercetti pulled up outside a small roadside diner called Rosie's, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the rain hit the roof of his car. He was here for a meeting, nothing complicated, just a quiet conversation with an associate named Sal over coffee. The kind of meeting Roman preferred. No witnesses, no noise, no attention. A man in an expensive coat sitting inside a worn-down diner was nobody worth looking at. That was exactly how he liked it. He walked in, shook the rain off his shoulders, and took the last booth in the back to the wall, facing the door. Always facing the door. It was a habit he'd had for so long he didn't even think about it anymore. The diner was almost empty. An old couple sharing a slice of pie near the window, a truck driver at the counter staring at his phone, a teenage girl refilling ketchup bottles near the kitchen with the slow, tired movements of someone 3 hours past the end of their patience. Roman ordered black coffee, checked his phone, and waited. Sal was already 10 minutes late. Roman wasn't the kind of man who fidgeted. He sat quietly, eyes moving around the room the way they always did, not out of nerves, but out of habit. You didn't survive in his world without knowing exactly who was in every room you walked into. That's when he noticed the boy. He was sitting alone in a corner booth on the far side of the diner. Small, maybe 4 or 5 years old. His feet didn't reach the floor. In front of him was a glass of water and a paper napkin he had folded into the shape of a boat. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. It was the kind of pale that comes from the inside. The boy coughed softly into his sleeve, the quiet, careful cough of a child trying not to be noticed. Roman looked at him for a moment, then looked away. Not his business. He picked up his phone, set it back down, glanced at the door, then, without meaning to, looked back at the boy. The boy was staring directly at him, and he didn't look away. Most children, when caught staring at a stranger, turn their eyes down immediately. This one didn't. He just looked at Roman with a calm, steady gaze, dark eyes, completely still, as if you were trying to figure something out. Roman felt something shift inside him, something quiet and uncomfortable that he couldn't name right away. He looked away again, told himself he was tired, told himself the drive had been long and the rain was making everything feel strange. And then she walked out of the kitchen. She was carrying 2 plates, moving quickly between the tables. Her hair was pulled back, not neatly. There was a small stain on the shoulder of her uniform. She was thinner than he remembered, noticeably thinner, and there was a tiredness in her face that went deeper than just one long shift. She looked like someone who had been running for a long time and had forgotten what it felt like to stop. Roman did not move. He wasn't sure he breathed. Alina. She hadn't seen him. She was already setting down the plates, nodding at something the truck driver said, turning back toward the kitchen, all without once looking at the back booth. Roman sat very still and let the years do their math. 5 years. She had left 5 years ago. No warning, no fight. Just a note on his kitchen counter. I can't do this anymore. And then she was gone. No address, no phone calls. He had looked for her in the beginning. Not desperately, but enough. Eventually, he had accepted that she didn't want to be found. He watched her cross the diner and crouch down beside the small boy in the corner booth. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. For just 1 second, the efficient mask she was wearing slipped, and he saw something underneath it. Fear. Exhaustion. The look of someone holding everything together through sheer will. Then the mask came back up. She said something to the boy, squeezed his hand, and went back to work. Roman slowly pulled out his phone and ran a quiet search, the kind his people could complete in minutes. The result came back fast. Noah Brooks, age 4. He stared at that number. 4 years old. He and Alina had ended 5 years ago. He looked up from the phone. The boy, Noah, was still watching him from across the diner. Same dark eyes, same steady stare, a gaze that was far too familiar to belong to a stranger's child. Roman set the phone face down on the table. His coffee had gone cold. Sal had never shown up. He barely registered either of these things. He was watching the kitchen door, waiting for Alina to come back out, because suddenly every other reason he had walked into this diner tonight had become completely irrelevant. From the corner booth, the boy coughed again, soft and small and tired. Roman exhaled slowly. Something had just begun. He didn't know exactly what it was yet, but he knew, with the same quiet certainty he trusted in every other area of his life, that nothing about tonight was going to end the way he had expected. Roman waited until the diner was nearly closing before he made his move. He had spent the last hour watching without appearing to watch. He saw Alina refill tables, clear plates, wipe down counters, and check on Noah every 20 minutes or so. Always brief, always quiet, always with that same tight expression that gave nothing away to anyone who didn't know how to look. But Roman knew how to look. He had spent his entire adult life reading people, and what he saw on Alina's face every time she glanced at that boy was not just a mother's love. It was fear. Old, deep, and very specific. When the last customer left and the teenage girl began stacking chairs, Roman stepped outside and stood in the narrow alley behind the diner, collar up against the rain, and waited. She came out 12 minutes later, carrying a black garbage bag in one hand and holding Noah's hand with the other. The boy was half asleep, leaning against her side, his small sneakers scraping the wet ground with every step. She dropped the bag into the bin, turned, and stopped completely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence between them. Alina recovered first. Her jaw tightened. She pulled Noah slightly closer to her side and looked at Roman the way you look at something dangerous that has appeared without warning. "Roman?" Her voice was flat, not surprised, not emotional, just flat, which told him she had probably already spotted him inside and had spent the last hour preparing for this exact moment. "Alina," he said quietly. "Whatever you're here for," she said, "the answer is no. I don't know what business brought you to this part of Brooklyn, but it has nothing to do with me. So please, move." She tried to walk past him. He didn't block her, didn't touch her, simply said, "Who is he?" She stopped walking but didn't turn around. "He's my son," she said. "That's all you need to know." "How old is he?" "Roman, how old, Alina?" She turned then, and for just a fraction of a second, before she locked it away, he saw it, a flash of something in her eyes, panic dressed up as anger. "4," she said. "He's 4 years old, and before you say another word, the answer to what you're thinking is no. You're wrong. Drop it." She was too fast with that answer, too prepared. "He was staring at me," Roman said, "inside the diner. Like he recognized me." "Children stare at strangers, Roman. That's what they do." "Not like that." "I'm not doing this." She started walking again, Noah still pressed to her side. "Don't follow us. Don't come back here. Whatever part of my life you think you just walked back into, you didn't." Roman watched her go. He let her go, but not because he believed her. He stood in the alley for a long moment after she turned the corner, the rain soaking through his coat, and he thought carefully about everything he had just seen. The boy's eyes. Her reaction. Not the anger, but the speed of it. The way she had answered his question before he had fully finished asking it, as if she had rehearsed this conversation in her head 100 times and had been praying it would never happen. He was almost back to his car when he heard it. A scream. short and sharp, from inside the diner. The teenage girl burst through the back door. "He collapsed. The little boy he fell off the chair and he's not—" Roman was through the door before she finished the sentence. Noah was on the floor beside the corner booth, unconscious, his small chest rising and falling in short, labored movements. Alina was already on her knees next to him, one hand on his face, her voice completely unraveling for the first time all night. "Noah, baby, open your eyes. Noah!" Roman crouched down across from her. He looked at the boy's lips, faintly bluish at the edges, and at the shallow, struggling way he was breathing, and he understood immediately that this was not a simple fainting spell. Whatever was wrong with this child had been wrong for a long time. He straightened up and made one phone call. 30 seconds later, he looked at Alina and said, "My car is faster than an ambulance in this rain. We're leaving, now." She looked up at him, and for the first time that night, she didn't argue. The hospital Roman chose was not the kind of place ordinary people ended up. It sat on the quieter side of Manhattan, behind a set of unmarked glass doors that opened into a lobby that looked more like a hotel than a medical facility. No overcrowded waiting room, no plastic chairs bolted to the floor, just clean white corridors, soft lighting, and staff who moved quickly and asked very few questions, because the people who came here paid enough to make questions unnecessary. Roman had Noah admitted within 4 minutes of walking through the door. Alina didn't ask how. She didn't say anything at all. She simply followed the nurses down the corridor, with her arms wrapped around herself, and Roman watched her go before turning and finding a quiet corner of the lobby to make a series of phone calls he didn't want anyone overhearing. By the time he had finished, he knew 3 things. He knew that the doctor assigned to Noah was the best pediatric specialist in the state, because Roman had personally insured it with a single conversation. He knew that Alina had brought Noah to a public clinic in Queens 3 months earlier, where a preliminary diagnosis had been made and then quietly buried under a pile of bills she hadn't been able to pay. And he knew that whatever the full diagnosis was, it was serious enough that the clinic had marked the file as urgent and then heard nothing back from the family. He sat down in one of the lobby chairs and waited. An hour passed, then another. At some point, a nurse brought him coffee he didn't ask for. He drank it without tasting it, watching the corridor where Alina had disappeared, and doing something he almost never did. He thought about the past. Not the business, not the 5 years in between. He thought about the 2 years before that, before the note on the kitchen counter, before she vanished. He thought about who Alina had been then, how clearly she had seen him, even the parts he kept hidden from everyone else, how she had never once asked him to be someone different, but had simply, quietly, reached a point where she couldn't stay. He had told himself for 5 years that it was her choice, and he respected it. Sitting in that hospital lobby, he was no longer entirely sure that was true. Just past 2 a.m, a doctor came to find him. Not Alina, him. Because the name on the admission paperwork, the name attached to the payment, was his. The doctor was a calm, precise man who delivered information the way Roman appreciated, directly, without softening the edges unnecessarily. Noah had a serious lung condition, a structural problem that had likely been present since birth, but had gone undetected and untreated long enough to become dangerous. Without surgery, a specific, complex procedure, the condition would continue to deteriorate. With the right surgery, performed soon, the prognosis was genuinely good. But soon was not a suggestion. Soon was a deadline. Roman asked 2 questions. The doctor answered both. He thanked him and waited until the man had walked away before sitting back down and staring at the floor for a long moment. Then he made one more phone call, a different kind this time, to a man who handled sensitive information quietly and charged a price that ensured his silence. Roman gave him a name, a date of birth, and a location. He told him what he needed and told him to be thorough. The results came back before sunrise. Roman sat alone in the lobby and read them on his phone. He read them once quickly, then again slowly, and then he set the phone on his knee and looked out through the glass doors at the gray, pre-dawn street outside. Noah Brooks was his son. He had known it in the diner, somewhere below the level of thought. Known it the moment those dark eyes had found him across the room without flinching. But knowing something instinctively and having it confirmed in cold, factual terms are two entirely different experiences. One you can dismiss. The other sits in your chest and does not move. Roman had built an empire on his ability to remain unmoved. He had made decisions that other men couldn't stomach and had slept afterward without difficulty. He had always believed that control was something you either had or you didn't, and he had always had it. He sat in that quiet lobby at 5 a.m. with a phone in his hand and the results of a DNA test on the screen. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure that was still true. Down the corridor, behind a closed door, his son was sleeping, and Roman Vercetti, who controlled half the underworld in New York, had not even known the boy existed until 8 hours ago. He found the apartment on his own. He didn't need anyone to give him the address. It was on the 3rd floor of a tired building in Queens, the kind of building where the elevator hadn't worked in years, and the hallways smelled like old cooking and something damp that never fully dried. Roman climbed the stairs, found the door with the slightly bent number 7 nailed to it, and knocked twice. There was a long pause before it opened. Alina looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they had hoped had resolved itself overnight. She was still in the same clothes from the diner. Her hair was loose now, and her eyes carried the specific emptiness of someone who hadn't slept at all, but was too wired with worry to feel tired yet. She didn't open the door all the way. "How did you find this address?" she said. "Alina, that was not a small question, Roman." "I know where you live," he said simply. "I've known since last night. Can I come in?" She looked at him for a moment, then stepped back and let the door swing open. The apartment was small, smaller than he had expected, and he hadn't expected much. A single couch with a blanket folded over the arm, a kitchen table with 2 mismatched chairs, a child's drawings taped to the refrigerator, uneven houses, stick figures, a sun with too many rays. Against one wall there was a small bookshelf crammed with picture books, and, on the very top shelf, 3 prescription medicine bottles lined up in a neat row. Roman looked at those bottles for a moment before looking away. There was a narrow hallway leading to what he assumed were 2 small rooms. Somewhere down that hallway, Noah was asleep. They had kept him overnight at the hospital for observation, but discharged him by mid-morning with instructions and a follow-up appointment that Roman had already arranged without telling Alina. She stood in the middle of the room with her arms crossed and watched him take it all in. "Say what you came to say," she said. "I want to help," Roman said. "Noah needs surgery. It's expensive and it needs to happen quickly. I can cover everything, the procedure, the recovery, whatever comes after. I can also move you both somewhere safer and more comfortable while— No." The word came out before he had finished the sentence. "Alina, listen to what I'm saying. He needs—" "I know what he needs." Her voice was sharp, but underneath the sharpness was something that had been stretched too thin for too long. "I have been managing his condition for 2 years, Roman. 2 years. Don't walk in here after one night and talk to me about what my son needs." "He's my son, too." The room went very quiet. Alina unfolded her arms, then folded them again. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the street below. And when she turned back around, her expression had changed. The defensive anger was still there, but behind it now was something older and more complicated. "I hid the pregnancy," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I knew what I was doing, and I made the choice deliberately." She paused. "I left because I couldn't watch you get killed, Roman. Or arrested, or whatever was going to happen eventually, because something always eventually happens in your world. I left because I loved you, and I could see exactly how the story ended, and I wasn't strong enough to stay and watch it." She gestured at the small room around her, the worn furniture, the cracked baseboard, the medicine bottles on the shelf. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I made a decision. A selfish one, maybe, but I decided I would rather raise my child in a small apartment where he was safe than in a mansion where people might use him to get to you. She looked at him steadily. I still believe that. Roman said nothing for a moment. He looked around the apartment again, really looked this time, at the unpaid bills half hidden under a fruit bowl on the counter, at the cheap space heater in the corner plugged into an extension cord, at the 3 medicine bottles lined up with careful precision on that top shelf. She had been carrying all of this alone, for years. He had walked into rooms his entire life and known exactly what to do. He always had a move, always had leverage, always had a plan that gave him the upper hand. Standing in that small Queens apartment, looking at the life Alina had been quietly surviving inside, he had nothing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Roman Vercetti felt completely powerless. The underworld has its own nervous system. It doesn't run on newspapers or phone calls or anything as clean as information. It runs on whispers. A word dropped in the right ear at the right moment. A name mentioned once in a room where it shouldn't have been mentioned. A question asked that reveals more than the answer ever could. And in New York, that nervous system was fast. Faster than most people understood. By the 3rd day after the diner, the whispers had already started. Roman first felt it the way he always felt trouble, not through any single piece of information, but through a change in atmosphere. The way a room adjusts when something shifts. He noticed it in small things. A phone call that ended a little too quickly. An associate who chose his words more carefully than usual. A meeting that was postponed without a proper reason. Something was moving out there. He didn't know what yet, but he had survived long enough in this life to trust that feeling the way other men trusted weather forecasts. He said nothing to Alina. He had left her apartment the previous day without resolution. No agreement, no argument won, simply a silence between them that neither had known how to break. He had driven back across the bridge with the image of those medicine bottles sitting in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. He had gone back to his world, his office, his people. And he had started, very quietly, making arrangements that Alina didn't know about and hadn't agreed to. A car now sat parked across the street from her building, unmarked, unremarkable. 2 of his most trusted men working in shifts. Roman hadn't told them why. He didn't need to explain himself. He had simply said, "Watch." And they watched. It was a precaution. He told himself it was only a precaution. He was in his office on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown when the first concrete piece of information arrived. It came through a man named Gregor, a Hungarian who had been feeding Roman quiet intelligence for 6 years in exchange for protection he would never openly admit to needing. Gregor didn't call. He sent a single message through a channel they used for things that couldn't be said out loud. It said, "Caruso's people are asking about you. Not business. Personal." Roman read it twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Marco Caruso was not a new problem. He was the head of a rival operation that had been quietly expanding into territory Roman controlled, testing edges, pushing where he could. They had maintained an uneasy balance for 2 years. Not peace exactly, but a mutual understanding that open conflict was expensive for both of them. Marco was smart enough to know that. He was also smart enough to know that the moment any kind of weakness appeared in Roman's position, the balance would tip. Personal, Gregor had said. Not business. Personal. Roman thought about that word and understood immediately what it meant. Someone had connected the dots. Someone had seen him at that hospital or outside that apartment building in Queens, or had noticed the 2 men sitting in the unmarked car across the street. And someone had taken that information to Marco Caruso and explained what it meant. Roman Vercetti had a child, a hidden one, an unknown one. A 4-year-old boy with a lung condition living in a third-floor apartment in Queens with a woman who had no protection and no idea that the world she had been hiding from had just looked up and noticed her. Roman stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The city spread out below him, gray and indifferent, full of people moving through their lives without knowing the currents running underneath. He had spent 20 years learning how to use those currents. He knew better than anyone what happened when a man like Marco Caruso identified something that mattered to you. They never came for you directly. That was the oldest mistake, and Marco was too experienced to make it. They came for the thing you cared about. They came for the leverage. Roman turned from the window and picked up his phone. He called the men outside Alina's building and told them not to leave, not for any reason. He called 2 more men and told them to position themselves near Noah's hospital follow-up appointment the next morning. Then he stood in the middle of his office, very still, and understood something with perfect clarity. He had spent 5 years believing that Alina leaving had been the end of a story. It hadn't been. It had only been the pause before the most dangerous chapter, and that chapter had just quietly opened. Alina had always been stubborn. Roman had known that from the beginning. It was one of the things he had loved about her once, the way she made decisions and held on to them regardless of what anyone else thought. In another life, in a simpler world, it would have been an admirable quality. In this situation, it was dangerous. Despite everything, despite Noah's condition, despite the hospital visit, despite Roman showing up at her door, she had made one small concession that morning. Noah had been asking for weeks to go to the small community school 2 streets from their apartment. Just for a day, he had said, just to see what it was like. Alina, who had been keeping him close and indoors for so long, had looked at his pale face across the breakfast table and decided that one normal day couldn't hurt. She had not told Roman. She had no reason to. As far as she was concerned, Roman was a complication she was managing, not a partner she was consulting. She dressed Noah in his warmest jacket, made sure he had his inhaler in his bag, and walked him to school herself, staying until she was sure he was settled before heading back for her morning shift at the diner. She would pick him up at 2 o'clock. It was a 12-minute walk. She had done longer distances alone 100 times. What she didn't know was that the 2 men Roman had stationed outside her building had been pulled away 40 minutes earlier. A phone call had come through to both of them, a convincing voice, a fabricated emergency, instructions that sounded like they came from Roman himself. By the time the real Roman discovered what had happened, it was already too late. Alina arrived at the school at 5 minutes past 2. The teacher met her at the door with an expression that made Alina's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. Noah had been signed out 40 minutes ago, the teacher said carefully, by his father. The world tilted. Alina grabbed the sign-out sheet. The name written there was not Roman's. It was a name she didn't recognize, written in handwriting that was neat and deliberate and completely unhurried, which somehow made it worse. This had not been rushed. It had been planned carefully, executed cleanly, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. She was already running before she reached the end of the street. She called Roman on the number he had given her, the one she had saved in her phone under no name, just a series of X's, because she hadn't been ready to admit to herself that saving it was necessary. He picked up on the first ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "They took Noah." There was a silence on the other end that lasted less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she heard something shift in Roman's breathing, a change so small that most people would have missed it. She didn't miss it. She had spent 2 years learning every sound he made. Then his voice came back, completely level, completely controlled, which frightened her more than shouting would have. "Where are you right now?" She told him. "Don't move," he said. "I'm 4 minutes away." He was there in 3. He pulled up in a black car, got out without turning off the engine, and looked at her face for exactly 1 second before he understood everything he needed to understand. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't waste time with questions she had already answered on the phone. He made 2 calls standing right there on the pavement. Short, quiet, specific. The kind of calls where the person on the other end doesn't ask questions either. Then he turned to Alina, and she saw it for the first time. Not the composed man who had sat in her apartment and offered money. Not the patient man who had stood in the rain and waited for answers. Underneath all of that was something else entirely. Something that had been sitting very still and had now stood up. "I'm going to find him," he said. His voice was quiet, not reassuring quiet, certain quiet. The kind of certainty that doesn't ask for your belief because it doesn't need it. Alina looked at him and felt two things simultaneously. A relief so sharp it almost hurt, and a fear just as sharp underneath it. Because the man standing in front of her now was not the Roman she had been arguing with for 3 days. This was the other one. The one she had left to protect her son from. And right now, he was the only hope her son had. Roman worked fast, and he worked without hesitation. Within 20 minutes of leaving Alina on that pavement, he had the first piece of information he needed. It came from a man who owed him a debt that had been sitting unpaid for 3 years. The kind of debt that, when Roman finally called it in, got answered immediately and completely. A van, a license plate, a direction. He made one more call after that. A single sentence, and within the hour the city's underworld began to move in a way it hadn't moved in years. Not with the slow, calculated pressure Roman usually preferred, but with something faster and less forgiving. Warehouses that belonged to Caruso's operation were visited without warning. Doors came off hinges. Men who had been comfortable and untouchable an hour earlier found themselves suddenly, uncomfortably exposed. Word spread the way it always spreads in that world. Instantly, and with elaboration. Roman Versetti's son had been taken. Roman Versetti was not negotiating. Informants who had been sitting on information for months decided, quite quickly, that tonight was the night to share it. By 9 o'clock he had a location. A dockyard on the eastern edge of the city. The kind of place that was busy during the day and completely invisible at night. A cluster of storage units backing up against the water, surrounded by chain-link fence and the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. 3 vehicles parked outside that didn't belong there, lights on inside one of the units near the far end. Roman arrived with 4 men he had trusted for years, men who didn't need to be briefed extensively because they had done this kind of work before and knew what was required of them. He didn't go in loudly. He went in the way he did everything, quietly, and with complete clarity about what the outcome was going to be. It was over in less than 12 minutes. He found Noah in the back of the unit, sitting on a folded blanket in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. Someone had given him a bottle of water and a bag of crackers, a small, almost absurd detail that Roman registered and then put aside. The boy looked up when Roman came through the door, and his face cycled through several expressions very quickly. Fear first, then recognition, then something that cracked open in Roman's chest and stayed there. "Hi," Noah said. His voice was small and hoarse. Roman crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched down in front of him. He looked the boy over carefully. Hands, face, the way he was breathing. Shallow. Faster than it should be. "Are you hurt?" Roman asked. Noah shook his head. Then he coughed, that same soft, careful cough from the diner, the one he tried to hide. Except now, in a cold storage unit at a dockyard at night, it sounded worse, more labored. Roman could hear the effort behind it. He took off his coat without thinking and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. Noah looked up at him from inside the oversized coat with those dark, steady eyes, and said nothing. He didn't cry, he didn't shake. He simply looked at Roman with the same calm, measuring gaze he had used in the diner, as if he were still trying to work something out about this man and was getting closer to an answer. Roman picked him up carefully. Noah tucked his head against Roman's shoulder with the immediate, uncomplicated trust that only small children are capable of. The kind of trust that has no conditions attached to it, that doesn't account for history or complication, or the fact that they had been strangers 4 days ago. Roman stood very still for just a moment. He had walked into that dockyard with absolute certainty. Certain about the plan, certain about the outcome, certain in the way he was always certain when operating in his own world. He had not expected the certainty to dissolve the instant a small boy put his head on his shoulder. But it did. He carried Noah out through the door and into the night air. One of his men brought the car around. Roman got in the back without releasing his hold on the boy and told the driver to move. Noah fell asleep against his chest before they reached the main road. Roman sat in the dark back seat of the car with his son sleeping in his arms and looked out at the city moving past the window. The same city he had spent 20 years controlling, managing, bending to his own purposes. For the first time, he looked at it and saw it for exactly what it was, a place that had almost taken everything. The surgery was scheduled for 6 a.m. Roman had arranged it the night before, while Noah was being assessed in the emergency wing and Alina was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand with both of hers. Roman had stood in the corridor outside the room and made the calls quietly, efficiently, the way he did everything. By the time Alina came out to find him, the paperwork was already signed and the surgical team had been assembled. She looked at him for a long moment when he told her. Then she said, very quietly, "You had no right to do that without asking me." "I know," he said. "I am his mother, Roman. Every decision about his life goes through me. That was not yours to make." "I know," he said again. "The surgery is at 6. She stared at him. He could see her working through it, the anger, which was real and justified, running directly into the relief, which was just as real and far more complicated. The two things existed simultaneously in her face, and neither one won. She went back inside the room without another word. Roman found a chair at the end of the corridor and sat in it for the rest of the night. He didn't sleep. He watched the nurses pass back and forth, watched the corridor lights hold their steady, indifferent brightness, and he thought. Not about the operation, not about Caruso, who was already being handled through channels that would ensure nothing like this ever had the opportunity to happen again. Not about the men who had taken Noah, or the dockyard, or any of the events of the past several hours. He thought about the moment Noah had put his head on his shoulder. That was the thought he kept returning to. That specific moment. The weight of the boy, the uncomplicated ease of it, the way it had happened so naturally that it took Roman several seconds to even register what had occurred. He had held his son for the first time in his life in the back of a car driving away from a dockyard, and the boy had simply gone to sleep, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Roman spent all 4 in that corridor chair. At one point, a nurse offered him coffee, and he accepted it without registering what he was doing. At another point, Alina came out and sat in the chair across from him, not next to him, and they sat in silence for a long time without it being uncomfortable. Eventually, she said, "He asked about you. Last night, before he fell asleep. He asked who you were." Roman looked at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were someone who was helping us." She paused. "He said you smelled like rain." Roman looked back down at the floor. "Alina," he said after a moment, "I'm not going to fight you for him. I want you to know that. Whatever happens after today, that's not what this is." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than before. "Then what is it?" He didn't answer that question, not directly, because he wasn't sure he had the right words for it yet, and he had long ago learned that saying something imprecisely was often worse than not saying it at all. The surgeon came out at 10:30 with good news. The procedure had gone well, Noah was stable, recovery would take time, but the prognosis was excellent. Alina exhaled in a way that seemed to release something she had been holding in her body for months. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She thanked the surgeon and went to find her son. Roman stayed in the corridor. After a while, he took the elevator to the top floor, a small rooftop access used by staff for breaks, and stood outside in the cold morning air looking out over the city. The sun was up properly now, thin and pale, the kind of winter light that illuminates without warming anything. He stood there for a long time, and he made a decision. Not dramatically, not with any particular sense of ceremony. It arrived the way the most important decisions usually arrive, quietly, after everything else has already made the answer obvious. He thought about Noah in that storage unit, Noah in the diner, Noah's eyes finding him across a room full of strangers as if they already knew each other. He thought about what it would mean to stay exactly as he was. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls. Each one dismantled something he had spent years building. He transferred authority to people he trusted. He cut ties with operations that could never be made clean. He closed doors that, once closed, would not reopen. It took 19 minutes. 20 years of his life, restructured in 19 minutes on a hospital rooftop on a cold morning in Manhattan. When he was done, he put the phone in his pocket and stood quietly for a moment, looking at the city below, and felt, beneath everything else, something he hadn't felt in so long he had forgotten it was something a person could feel. Still. 1 week later, Noah was well enough to sit up on his own. The color had come back to his face. Real color, not the temporary flush of a fever, but the steady, ordinary pink of a child who was healing properly. He ate breakfast with an appetite that made the nurses smile. He asked for his paper and crayons and filled 3 sheets with drawings that he described in great detail to anyone who would listen. A dog, a house with a very large door, a man standing in the rain. Alina looked at that last drawing for a long time without saying anything. Roman visited every day that week, always briefly, always at times when the corridor was quiet and there were no unnecessary witnesses. He would check in with the medical team, ensure everything was on track, and leave without making it into anything larger than it was. He did not go into Noah's room every time. Some days he simply stood at the window of the corridor and looked in, and that was enough. On the last day, the morning Noah was being discharged, Roman arrived at the park across from the hospital just before 7. It was early enough that the park was almost empty. A man walking a dog in the distance, 2 pigeons investigating something near a bench. The trees were bare, the paths still damp from overnight rain, and the whole place had the particular quiet of a city that hadn't fully woken up yet. Roman sat on a bench near the east entrance and waited. He had chosen this. He wanted to see them leave the hospital. He wasn't sure why exactly. He didn't examine it too closely. He simply knew that he needed to see it with his own eyes. Needed to see them walk out into the morning together, healthy and unhurt, before he did what he had already decided to do. Alina came out first, carrying a bag over one shoulder. She looked different from the woman in the diner, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to a stranger, but Roman noticed it. The set of her shoulders was different. Something that had been braced for a long time had, fractionally, released. Noah came out beside her, holding her hand, wearing a blue jacket Roman hadn't seen before, and moving with the careful, slightly self-conscious steps of someone who had been told to take things slowly and was trying very hard to comply. They crossed the street toward the park. Roman stayed where he was. He watched them come through the east entrance, watched Noah immediately point at the pigeons and say something that made Alina laugh. A real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that escapes before you can think about it. Noah pulled at her hand, and she let him lead her toward the birds, and they stood together, watching the pigeons with the specific, total absorption of a small boy and a mother who, for the first time in a long time, had nothing more urgent to attend to. Roman looked at them for a moment. Then Noah turned around, the way children do, with that radar they seem to have for being observed, and saw him. He didn't look surprised. He simply looked, with those dark, steady eyes, and then raised one hand in a small, serious wave. Roman raised his hand back. Noah said something to Alina. She turned. When she saw Roman on the bench, she went very still for a moment, and something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. Too many things layered on top of each other. Then she nodded at him. Once. small but real. Noah had already started walking toward him with the careful, determined steps of someone on a mission. He stopped in front of Roman's bench and looked up at him. "Are you coming with us?" he asked. Roman looked at him for a long moment, at the dark eyes, at the face that was his own face, rearranged into something newer and better and completely uncomplicated by everything Roman had spent his life becoming. "Not today," Roman said quietly. Noah considered this with the gravity that 4-year-olds bring to information they don't entirely understand. Then he said, simply, with the devastating innocence of a child who doesn't yet know what words cost, "Are you my dad?" The park was very quiet. Roman looked at the boy in front of him, his son, who had his eyes and his stillness and absolutely none of his damage, and felt something move through him that he had no name for and didn't try to find one. He reached out and straightened the collar of Noah's blue jacket. Carefully, gently. "Go with your mom," he said. Noah looked at him for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back to Alina, who took his hand without a word and began walking slowly down the path. Roman stayed on the bench. He watched them until they reached the far end of the park. Alina, unhurried, Noah stopping twice to look at things along the way, the two of them moving together in the easy, unself-conscious rhythm of people who belong to each other completely. At the gate, Noah turned around one last time. He raised his hand again in that same small, serious wave. Roman raised his back. Then they were gone. He sat for a while longer after they disappeared, not because he hadn't accepted it, but because he wanted to hold the morning for just a little longer. The bare trees, the empty paths, the thin winter light coming through the branches. He thought about Noah's question. "Are you my dad?" The simplicity of it. The way it had landed without drama, without accusation, without any of the weight that surrounded it from every other direction. Just a small boy asking a straightforward question in a quiet park. Roman had not answered it. Not directly. He thought now that perhaps not answering was itself an answer, just not the one either of them could live with yet. Maybe someday. Maybe when the life he was carefully, methodically dismantling was far enough behind him that it could no longer reach forward and touch the people it had already come too close to. Maybe then. He stood up from the bench, turned up his collar against the cold, and walked in the opposite direction. He did not look back. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered more than anything he had ever walked away from, and he had learned, the hardest way a person can learn something, that the things which matter most are sometimes the ones you have to love from a distance. He chose the distance, so they could have the closeness. That was the only empire he had left, and for the first time in 20 years, it was enough.